Let's try a little activity. Count the number of ducks that you see in the background. Are you ready? Go. You probably counted 10, but did you see the rabbits? Now I want you to count the number of rabbits that appear. Ready? Go. So did you count 10 rabbits? Or did you still see ducks? The truth is, the image can either be seen as a rabbit or a duck. However, what you saw was probably influenced by the question stem. In other words, you probably saw duck when I said duck and rabbit when I said rabbit. This is an example of priming. Priming involves cues that can implicitly influence behavior, attitudes. The concept of priming was initially introduced by Carl Lashley in 1951 as a possible explanation for how the mind prepares behavioral responses. Lashley first coined the term when he was attempting to discern how serial response sequences, for instance speech production, occur quickly and with seemingly little effort. His belief was that there was a mediating state that connects intention and execution of intended behavior. The mediating state, he argued, assembles the action so that it is in the appropriate serial sequence. In other words, the state was priming the response. However, in the context of psychological literature and experimentation, priming had taken on a new meaning. In 1958, Storms and his colleagues conducted a study in which participants were provided a list of words to learn. Afterwards, they underwent a free association test, where they were asked to state the first word that came to mind after presentation of a stimulus word. Storms noticed something surprising. Participants were more likely to give words from the memory task as associates than commonly given associates. For example, if the list contained the word kitten, then participants were more likely to say kitten when hearing the word cat than instead of, say, dog. He referred to this as a recency effect. However, in 1960, researchers Siegel and Kofer were the first to call this priming, or quote, the recent use of a concept in one task on the probability of its usage in a subsequent unrelated task. Siegel and Kofer also replicated Storm's experiment, only this time without instructing participants to explicitly recall the words presented. They found that simply exposing participants to the word list increased the chance that those words would be used in the following free association task. With these findings, the use of priming as an experimental technique gained popularity as it demonstrated that memory of certain information is stored, despite one's inability to recall it. This in turn underscored the difference between explicit and implicit memory recall. Following studies analyzing priming manipulations also use an unrelated studies paradigm, in which mental concepts are formed in one context, and a subsequent unrelated context is used to determine the influence of those mental concepts on one's response. These types of studies aim to illustrate the effects of carryover from one experience to another context, in the absence of conscious awareness. For instance, in 1977, researchers Higgins, Rolls, and Jones discovered that carryover effects could unconsciously influence impression formation. First, participants were auditorily presented with synonyms for specific personality traits that were either negative, like reckless and conceited, or positive, like adventurous and self-confident. They were asked to remember these words and repeat them back to the researchers. Next, in an experiment they believed was entirely unrelated to the first, the participants read a paragraph about a man named Donald, who behaved in a manner seemingly disconnected from the prime traits. For instance, Donald was described as being a person who actively sought excitement, wanted to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, and did not rely on others. After reading about Donald, the participants were asked to rate the stimulus person's desirability. The researchers found that those who were presented with the negative words formed a more unfavorable or negative impression of the stimulus person, whereas those who were exposed to positive words developed a more positive or favorable impression. In both cases, participants showed no evidence of having been influenced by the words presented earlier to them during the memory task. One important thing to point out is that unlike the previous reassociation studies conducted by Siegel, Kofer, and Storms, the participants in Higgins et al. Study did not use the exact prime words that were presented to them. Instead, their overall impression of Donald, whether it was positive or negative, was influenced by the connotation of the words. This study demonstrated once again how experiences can passively and unconsciously affect one's decision.
Despite this long history of research into the subject, mapping out the brain regions involved in priming has not been straightforward because it can take place with many different kinds of stimuli, which require different parts of the brain to process them. Priming is thought to be a form of implicit memory because it has the ability to influence our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors based on our previously acquired knowledge and experiences without us being consciously aware of it. The prefrontal cortex serves a role in mediating cognitive functions and retrieving explicit memories. Reduced activation has been reported in this region after priming. This could indicate we rely on implicit memory to carry out tasks more efficiently without the need to consciously process their execution. As a matter of fact, amnesic patients who lack the ability to retrieve explicit memories are still able to retrieve implicit memories, including those that are developed with priming, indicating that implicit memories are mediated by regions of the brain other than the prefrontal cortex. The majority of us probably experience priming most often with visual stimulation. Several fMRI studies have shown that after priming with repeated exposure to visual stimuli, the left prefrontal cortex, the extrastriate visual cortex, and the occipitotemporal cortex, all of which are activated when exposed to novel objects and images, reduce their activity. These findings reaffirm the notion that less effort needs to be put into processing visual information as we grow familiar with the images presented to us. Additionally, Reichel et al. 1994 found increased activity in the bilateral insular cortex after priming with novel objects, suggesting that the brain transitions from a more effortful mechanism to process visual stimuli to a less demanding one once they lose their novelty after repeated exposure. In contrast, a 2000 fMRI study by James et al. In which subjects were primed to recognize new objects did not show decreased activation in regions of the brain associated with object recognition, and instead only demonstrated earlier activation in these regions among primed participants when compared to non-primed participants, thus indicating faster recognition. The fusiform gyrus, the peristriate, which includes areas V2 and VP, and the dorsolateral frontal cortex were identified as regions of the brain that showed faster activation upon recognition of a primed object. Another study by Bengtson et al. 2011 looked into the cognitive effects of self-esteem and self-concept. Participants were primed with words that had either clever or stupid connotations and were then given a memory task. The clever group showed increased reaction times while the stupid group showed decreased reaction times after each error they made in the memory task. fMRI scans showed that the anterior paracingulate cortex, which is responsible for error monitoring, increased its activity in the clever group and decreased its activity in the stupid group. These findings suggest that words that can be attributed to our self-perceptions can influence our brain activities and alter our behaviors to conform to the connotations of these words. Tactile stimulation can also influence our social behaviors and perceptions. In a 2013 fMRI study conducted by Schaefer et al., participants were given no tactile stimulation, or they touched rough sandpaper or the smooth bristles of a paintbrush before and during viewing the first 5 seconds of a 19-second social interaction that contained both positive and negative components. The participants viewed a total of 96 social interactions and were then asked to answer questions regarding the nature of each. The questions asked whether the social interactions were friendly or adversarial, social or professional, and so on. The results showed that participants primed with rough stimuli perceived the interactions as more adversarial, harsh, and difficult, even though they were all ambiguous because of their mixture of positive and negative components. The fMRI data showed a significant relationship between the amount of activity in the primary somatosensory cortex and the degree in which the participants perceived the social interactions to be adversarial and harsh upon receiving rough tactile stimulation.
Priming plays a significant role in marketing and consumer culture. In particular, many companies take advantage of the priming effect to bias the decisions of consumers towards buying a brand's product. Perhaps most disturbingly, this is especially prevalent in the food industry. In Harris, Barg, and Brownell's 2009 study on the priming effects of televised food advertisements, children exposed to cartoons with food advertisements consumed 45% more snacks during and after programming than children in a control group without food advertisements. This is particularly concerning considering how frequently children are exposed to a multitude of food advertisements through television and other media outlets daily. Moreover, these implications are considerably more troubling in the context of the types of food that are advertised, i.e., low-nutrient and unhealthy foods. There's a plethora of research confirming these findings and expanding upon them further. In 2014, Connell, Brooks, and Nielsen examined the long-term effects of adults exposed to unhealthy food advertisement stimuli, for example, Frosted Flakes, McDonald's, Kellogg's Fruit Loops, in childhood. Childhood exposure led to increased bias towards these brands that strongly persisted into adulthood due to these early positive effect associations, and were consequently resistant to change.
Marketing priming and subsequent biased decision-making is not, of course, limited to food alone. In a 2008 study of brand exposure effects on behavior, Fitzsimmons, Chartrand, and Fitzsimmons demonstrated that priming participants with a particular brand produced specific behaviors associated with the curated image or idea of that brand. For example, subjects primed with stimuli specific to Apple demonstrated higher levels of creativity in subsequent tests than subjects exposed to IBM stimuli as well as controls. Consequently, subjects primed with Disney-related stimuli showed greater honesty on measures following priming compared to subjects exposed to E as well as controls. Social media, of course, plays a large role in biased decision-making through priming as well, as we often see in targeted user ad content curated to produce an implicit specific feeling or reaction in the user. The media plays a crucial role in using priming to create public biases on a global scale, particularly in reference to group stereotypes. In 1996, Power, Murphy, and Coover primed subjects with positive counter-stereotypes and negative stereotypes for women and African Americans as they are depicted in the media. Participants primed with a negative stereotype of African American males made more personal attributions of responsibility to African American males presented in unrelated media stories. For instance, a famous example like Rodney King. Subjects primed with negative stereotypes of women later perceive women to have less credibility in a particular event. Stereotypes primed in media can potentially have a powerful influence on public support for measures of public policy. In 2009, Johnson et al. Conducted a study using priming of negative African American stereotypes to reduce white participant support for social welfare and disaster relief to help African American individuals compared to white individuals, relative to control subjects. Priming is also a key player in the realm of politics. In a 1994 analysis of the 1960 presidential election, researchers posit that John F. Kennedy used priming as a highly successful campaign plan through which he was able to bridge the gap between platform issues popular with the public and his personal image as a candidate, to integrate the two by priming the public to make these associations. Another analysis cited the 2000 Bush-Gore presidential election as support for the aforementioned priming conjecture of public associations between a candidate's policy issues and their personal attributions. The author focused on the power of frequency priming and potentially using these associations to keep candidates accountable for positions and policy issues once in office. As we see in the studies mentioned, and all around us, of course, media plays an instrumental role in propagating and perpetuating biases, particularly racial stereotypes. However, it can also be a powerful tool used to combat biases, specifically negative ones. A 2007 study discovered that subjects' implicit racial stereotype biases were substantially reduced when they were provided with media literacy training to improve their critical analysis of information presented in media stories, as well as subjected to stereotype disconfirming news. Even in the aforementioned 1996 Power et al. Study, subjects primed with positive counter-stereotypes attributed unrelated media portrayals of African Americans to circumstance, external to the African American individual involved, instead of personal attributions. Subjects primed with counter-stereotypes of women perceived greater credibility of them in a media story compared to those primed with negative stereotypes. So have we convinced you yet how important priming is? How about this? Research indicates that a lack of priming, for an outgroup specifically, can also potentially contribute to bias formation, particularly at a young age. A 2012 research study and literature review found a recurrent theme of bias in children's behavior against African Americans through several behavioral reporting measures and test questions, overwhelmingly correlated to lack of exposure to other cultures. However, priming with exposure to a diverse array of influences can potentially change or prevent these biases. Children exposed to multicultural influences through friends or literature display increased cultural sensitivity, awareness, and empathy towards others from groups they are otherwise unfamiliar with.